Hi everyone, welcome to our first video for week 2 of CSC281. I wanted to do a very brief overview of what we're going to be covering today in these lectures, and I'll be using the notes of CSC281 week 2 to do this. At the start of these notes, we look a bit about input and output. Now, in your Python courses, you have already tried using these before. We use them as the input value. So, of course, in Python, you can say something like A is equal to the value of input, and then you can also provide a prompt. So in this instance, I won't provide a prompt, but if I just put in anything in here, maybe like a string that says hello world, and then I print A, we see we get hello world. And then in Python, again, I can provide a prompt that says, please enter. And again, I like to get a bit fancy with the colons and the spacing, but essentially we could say here, please enter again, hello world 2.0, something like that. And then again, if we print A, we see we get this. So that is what we mean when we refer to input and output, and you've seen that before in your Python courses. Python does it a bit easier. In Java, we're going to be using something called a scanner, and a scanner is a class that allows a program to read an input taken from the standard input, which is what the console is. So Java is a very powerful tool because we can actually manipulate this console and scanner in more advanced courses as well. But for our purposes here, we're just going to be relying on the Java utility package that provides this functionality for us. Now, because Java is more of an object-oriented programming languages, and an object-oriented programming language in comparison to Python, you'll see here that we actually need to make a scanner object, and a scanner object is going to have methods, a part of it, that are going to be able to read in items from the console that the user inputs. If the concept of objects and methods is a bit hazy, you don't need to worry too much. The syntax that we're going to be using to do this is very straightforward. One more thing though is, unlike Python, because Java is typeset, and essentially we need to be very specific about the types that we're dealing with in our variables. For instance, in Python, our input evaluation method can take in a string or an integer easily either way. It's not as easy as that as in Java. So you can see here we have this idea of a dot next int, and then we also have a dot next double. And then we're also going to be able to take in strings using the dot next. So again, this input is pretty similar to Python, except we're going to be using a bit more of typesetting to make sure that we're taking in proper types of data. We also were going to cover some conversions of strings into numerical data. And then after we do that, it's pretty straightforward, these ideas here, but we can't really do a very intense program with it. So we're also going to be covering for loops in this lecture, and then arrays. And again, arrays or lists in Python is what they call them. They're pretty interchangeable, but there's some things in arrays that we want to make sure we understand before we do comparisons to Python. We're going to do a pretty straightforward example that you'll see in CSC300 quite a bit, the smallest element in an array, and we're also going to be looking for the max in an array. And if you're ever doing a job interview or if you're ever taking tests or anything like that, those are pretty much the most straightforward areas you're going to see. We're also going to be looking at multidimensional or 2D arrays. You might have seen 2D lists before as well. It's very useful to understand these concepts before the later courses at DePaul, because there's a lot of programming courses that rely on tables and row and columns, and we can mimic that type of functionality using a multi-dimensional array or a 2D array. We're also going to be looking at exceptions. You've seen those quite a bit in 241, 242, try, except, or a break statement as well. It's pretty similar in Java, except we're going to be using try and catch. And we'll look at some more exception classes, and then we should be good to go for week 2.